Remember the scene in The Two Towers when Gollum argues with himself about whether he should murder Frodo and take the precious? That's basically how I feel about The Hunt for Gollum, the upcoming Lord of the Rings film, helmed by many of the same creative minds who adapted the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I'm split. I want to see this movie in kind of the same way I want to eat an entire tray of Ferrero Rocher. I know I'm going to enjoy it, but deep down I'll wonder if it's right. With the disappointment of the Hobbit trilogy still fresh in our memories, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's wondering if plans to revisit Middle-earth are born purely of a creative need to tell a story. So in this video, I want to do a feasibility study of this new Middle-earth story, an analysis of its possibilities and its pitfalls, with the core question being, is this the right path for a new Middle-earth story? So let's get into it on The Art of Storytelling. We don't know much about this new Lord of the Rings film, except that it seems to be focused on a period of time early in the events of the Fellowship of the Ring. When Gandalf begins to have suspicions about Bilbo's ring, he instructs Frodo to
keep it secret. Keep it safe.
And rides to Minas Tirith, where he realizes that Bilbo's ring is the Ring of Power. Then he goes back to warn Frodo. In the film, this whole sequence is beautifully concise at just 2.5 minutes. But if you've read the books, you'll recall that Gandalf is actually gone for 17 years. Gandalf actually mentions this hunt for Gollum when he's talking to Frodo.
I looked everywhere for the creature Gollum, but the enemy found him first.
That's all we get in the films. The books tell us a little more, but not much. During the Council of Elrond, we learn that Gandalf and Aragorn explored the whole length of Wilderland, down even to the Mountains of Shadow and the fences of Mordor. The search ends up being fruitless because at this time Gollum has already been captured and is being tortured by Sauron. Eventually Sauron releases Gollum, hoping that he will lead his spies to the ring. Aragorn and Gandalf split up, and Aragorn tracks Gollum's footprints through the dead marshes and actually does end up catching him. Aragorn takes him to the Elves of Mirkwood, and there Gandalf interrogates Gollum and finds out that he found the ring in the Great River and that he'd had it for 500 years. So Gandalf tells the elves to keep him imprisoned, but then Legolas gives him the bad news that some orcs already came to rescue Gollum and he managed to sneak away. Gandalf tells the council that he believes Gollum may play a part yet that neither he nor Sauron have foreseen. And this brings us right up to where we meet Gollum in the films, as he's stalking the Fellowship through the Mines of Moria. It should be noted that all this takes place in just a few paragraphs, and it's pure exposition, meaning it's only included in the text to help the reader understand the story. Tolkien was basically just filling in some plot holes here. He needed a way for Sauron to learn that a Baggins in the Shire had the ring, and he also needed a way for Gandalf to know that Sauron knew that. And of course, he needed to explain what happened to Gollum in the intervening years between the events of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. The point is that Tolkien recounts these events not because they constitute an essential part of the narrative, but because he's just trying to connect the dots. And this brings me to the first, and I think the biggest major pitfall for this film. It is not directly based on Tolkien's storytelling. The Lord of the Rings films were adapted from 3 complete books with a fully realized story. The material being adapted this time is just a couple pages from those books, so the writers will be essentially writing a story from scratch. Now, just to be clear, I'm a huge fan of the screen adaptation that Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and Fran Walsh wrote for The Lord of the Rings. It's a masterwork of storytelling, and there's no one in the world I trust more to write this film. But the fact remains that this time around they are writing an original story, and that's a different beast. Sure, the books give us a rough sketch of the events that take place during this period, but a chronology of events do not a story make. Exposition does not contain character development, nor drama, nor a moral arc. These will have to be conceived entirely by the film's writers. And this leads me to the second pitfall: Gollum as a protagonist. Andy Serkis is the director of the film, and he has described it as, quote, a deep dive where we investigate Gollum's character. On its surface, this seems to make sense. I mean, who doesn't love Gollum? He's certainly one of Tolkien's most interesting characters, and his portrayal in the films was excellent. So one might naturally assume that a character with his rich backstory and moral complexity has room for further development and exploration. But I think this is inviting a common fallacy in how we think about characters. Yes, Gollum is a rich and fascinating character, but characters shouldn't be considered in isolation from the stories in which they're written. Gollum is a character foil, one written deliberately to highlight, by contrast, the traits of the protagonist. His purpose in The Lord of the Rings is to show the reader what Frodo is at risk of becoming if he fails in his quest. The character Gollum exists to fulfill that purpose, and that purpose alone. The fact that Gollum is conflicted isn't only meant to tell you something about Gollum. Its ultimate purpose is to complicate the moral question confronting Frodo. We learn about Gollum as a means of learning about Frodo. We are told the story of Smeagol finding the ring and killing his best friend, ultimately so that we understand the true peril of Frodo's quest. Does Gollum, as we know him, have the capacity to be more than a character foil and actually be a protagonist? I don't know, because those are very different shoes to fill. I'll admit it's very interesting to imagine a story in which the audience is rooting for Gollum, but on the other hand, we have to keep in mind the third pitfall, and that is that we already know how Gollum's story ends. Prequel stories are almost always plagued by this problem because, well, it's hard to create tension if you already know the outcome. I bet you can think of a bunch of prequel movies that fell flat because they gave the character a backstory that just felt pointless, or worse, it actually contradicted something important about the character. And let's not forget that Gollum enters Frodo's story by trying to strangle him and take the ring, and he leaves it by biting Frodo's finger right off. So any backstory written for Gollum needs to lead to a place where he still has both the desire and capacity to murder innocent hobbits in cold blood. And that does limit Gollum's character to a narrow range of growth and transformation. If a character has no room for change, then there's no real story to tell. Now, with all those challenges laid out, let's talk about what excites me about this story. How can our extremely talented team of writers overcome these challenges? Well, there is a unique writing opportunity here, and that is Gollum's dual nature. Gollum is basically a BOGO, two characters for the price of one. For the purposes of storytelling, it doesn't really matter if two characters occupy the same body. You can write Smeagol and Gollum as protagonist and villain, respectively, and that inner conflict can sustain a story, and the writers know this because they already did it to great effect. I would wager that we're going to see more flashbacks to pre-Gollum Smeagol in this film to really make that distinction clear. Who was Smeagol before that fateful birthday on the Anduin River? Another possibility is that Gollum could be written as an outsider character. These are characters who observe the human condition from a certain distance so that they can give special insight into it. Frankenstein's monster might be a useful literary model for Gollum, someone who is fundamentally a victim, but who's nonetheless ostracized and made to suffer because he is different. This kind of character holds a mirror to humanity in a unique way because it confronts the audience with their own judgment. This is a really good fit for Gollum. And of course, the last thing that excites me is the simple fact that Tolkien's Middle-earth itself is rich with potential. And I don't just mean characters and dialogue and locations. I'm talking about the broader mythology and the themes that are so deeply woven into the tapestry of his world. Even if he didn't give us the precise story in this case, he certainly gave us a strong foundation for creating one. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you on the next one.